So there are two terms that are used interchangeably, microbiota and microbiome. And often they're confused. So microbiota is actually the microbes, the population of microbes, including viruses and bacteria and all that exists in any given part of the body. For example, the skin has a totally different microbiota. The gut and different parts of the gut have different microbiotas. The eyeball has a different microbiota. The placenta does. So those are the population of bacteria, viruses, and other organisms that exist. Microbiome is the totality of microbes and all their genetic elements. And that's where things change, because the genetic elements of the microbes really determine health and wellness in many ways. One of the things that's really important to note with the human being, right, we have to really change the way we look at ourselves. We used to think of ourselves as Homo sapiens sapiens, with this amazing creature that moved up the evolutionary ladder and the food chain and were just so awesome. When we look at our chromosomes, we've got 22,000 functional genes. Sounds like a lot, but you compare that to a rice plant or an earthworm that has double the amount of genes, we don't start to look that cool anymore, right? And so we're like, how do we conduct all the functions that we do on a daily basis with such limited number of genes? And as it turns out, the microbial genes within our body amount to about 3.3 million in total. So we've got 150 times more bacterial viral DNA in our body than human DNA. And it's looking like 99% of metabolic function, things that we do on a daily basis that make us human, are coded for by bacterial and viral DNA. So we can barely do anything for ourselves, right? And so we need the microbial DNA to conduct necessary function to live, to digest food, to breathe, even how our emotions and our view of the world are concentrated and how they're characterized are dependent on the types of microbes and microbial DNA we have in our system. So I love the view of a human being as a holobiome. A holobiome is a superorganism. We're really a walking, talking ecology, right? We're like a walking, talking rainforest. And there's a massive amount of structure to the ecology. Different parts of the body, different ecologies within the body have to communicate to one another, and we require all of their help in order to be human. We didn't exist and thrive as a human in isolation. We thrived as a human because we were able to pick up organisms from our environment and create the superorganism. With the mindset that we are highly dependent on our ecology, our body's ecology, in order to perpetuate health and even just conduct basic functions as a human being, we now know that we really can't even start to think about longevity and how we're going to live, into our hundreds, for example, without disease, without being propped up by medication, without really addressing the ecology of our body, and all of the things that we're doing to destroy that ecology on a daily basis. We now know that there's a new view of disease, right? So disease can be perpetuated by small perturbations in our ecology. So one small change in our ecology can amplify itself into a really serious condition. Autoimmune disease, for example, can be started by a simple course of antibiotics or another environmental trigger, being exposed to certain things like glyphosate or other weed killers and pesticides can start causing perturbations in the ecology, which will then amplify itself into this dysbiotic system called a disease. One of my big focuses is always, what are the things that we're doing in the modern world that our ancestors never did, which allowed them to evolve to give us this opportunity to exist in the world today. And some of the things that they really avoided and had actually no opportunity to do was to kill off microbes in a large scale on a daily basis, really for no good reason. One of the things we've done is we've demonized microbes, right? You'll see in all of these products that they sell at stores for household cleaning and use on personal care products, they'll say it kills 99.9% of bacteria. That has gotten to the psyche of the average American consumer or the Western consumer, is that we need to sanitize and sterilize our environment. That includes our own body. And that's a really dangerous thing because the microbes on our skin play a critical role in the health of our skin, not only the health of our skin, but the communication between our skin, our gut, our brain, our immune system, and so on. So every time we use an antimicrobial soap or hand sanitizer and we kill off these really good commensal bacteria within our skin, we're setting up the process of disease. And that turns into things like acne, atopic dermatitis, psoriasis, eczema. It can even turn into something as simple as just dry skin, which then breaks easier, and then you can get more microbes getting into the surface of the skin. The barrier function of the skin doesn't work anymore, and then we end up with MRSA infections and things that can be really serious. All of that just starts with simple perturbations of the ecology of our skin for no good reason. We look at our skin cells, and we've got a lot of skin cells. All we see is skin, right? But we've got about 50 bacteria cells for every one skin cell that's on our dermal layer. So we are far more bacteria on our outer shell than we are human skin cells. And yet, every day we're trying to perturb and cause disruption in them. And one of the things that people just don't realize, anytime we use antimicrobial products, what we're doing is selecting for more virulent and more pathogenic and more harmful organisms. Less than 2% of microbes ever discovered are harmful to humans. So that means 98+% is actually beneficial or benign. The best way to control that 2% is let the 98% flourish. One of the interesting studies recently on interaction with the environment and the resulting health effects has come from a study that Finland has funded on trying to identify why they're having actually an epidemic of allergies and asthma and immune dysfunctions within their country. Now, what's interesting is there's a geographic proximity to a town in Russia right by the border of Finland, and they're just a couple hundred kilometers apart, right? So their environment, temperature, everything seems to be about the same, and yet the people that live in this part of Russia have far lower incidence rates of things like chronic sinusitis, asthma, upper respiratory infection, and all of the things that go along with those kind of immune dysfunctions. And yet in Finland, it's much higher. And so they were trying to figure out, well, what is the difference between those two populations? As it turns out, when they look at the Russian population, the diversity and the presence of microbes, even pathogenic microbes, what we would consider pathogenic microbes, are much more abundant in their dust, in their air, in their household surfaces, and so on. And they go outside more, and they interact more with the dirt, they interact more with the outside environment, rather than the people in Finland. And that one change in how they live with regards to the environment has caused, I think it was a 2 or 3-fold increase in prevalence of asthma, allergies, chronic rhinosinusitis, conjunctivitis, and all of these upper respiratory diseases. And that's all the difference. They live a couple hundred kilometers apart, and yet their disease prevalence rates are so different because one population doesn't interact with the environment as much and the other one does. And that's a great example of how just in the last 40 years, things can change so drastically just with the simple exclusion of dirt. There are studies now that have shown that the human circadian rhythm that we know a lot about is actually matches up with what we call our microbial or microbiome rhythm. It has its own circadian rhythm. We call it a diurnal system because it has a night phase and a daytime phase. And a lot of it is actually dictated by the amount of calories coming in and the kind of foods that we're eating. So during the nighttime phase, when we're fasting, we have different types of microbes that start to flourish, and they do things like they eat some of the mucus layer, and they stimulate reproduction of the mucus layer, which is a very important protective barrier that separates the outside world from the inside of our body. And so these types of bacteria like Akkermansia mucinophilia, which is a mucin-loving bacteria, does well during the fasted state. And the moment we start feeding ourselves all these calories and foods, their levels start to go down. So what we're starting to see is that all of these metabolites and functions within the body are cyclical. You can't have the same bacteria always abundant at the same time. There's just not enough space. And with it being an ecology, things are going to fluctuate. And we now know that nighttime increases of these types of bacteria, the fasting type of bacteria, will actually increase healing, will actually increase something called autophagosomes, which actually will clean up DNA debris, dead cells, damaged tissue, and things like that. So that nighttime phase of bacteria becomes extremely important, and we destroy that by eating too frequently and never going into a real fasted state, right? So there's also some linkages now to sleep, cycling, and the production of things like GABA, BDNF with the nighttime nocturnal type of bacteria. So there's a great synchronicity between our own circadian rhythm and our microbes. We'll probably come to find out that our microbes control our own circadian rhythm. And if we're not sleeping well, if we're not recovering well, all of that probably has to do with not allowing certain microbes to flourish at that time of day. And I talk to people all the time about the microbiome and microbiota, and we're very quick to jump to these precise solutions, right? We want to affect this bacteria in some way, or eliminate this bacteria, grow this bacteria. We still don't know what exactly is doing what. What we know right now with fairly good certainty is general themes, right? The theme that more diversity improves health in general is a very solid theme. We know that. So we want to do things that increase bacterial diversity, but Prevotella is really bad, or Actinobacter is really bad, or Firmicutes, species of bacteria are really bad, and so we want to bring that down and increase this up. Or Clostridium is really bad. We're not there yet. We're literally at the tip of the iceberg of understanding this highly complex ecology, and the thing that makes it really hard is it's different in everybody. The most unique thing about you is your microbiome. No two individuals in the world have the same microbiome, not even identical twins. And they have exactly the same DNA, right? Everything about their genes is exactly the same. Their microbiome can be up to 30% different. That means they have 30 trillion organism difference within the microbiome, and that completely changes their body, their physiology, their health, their wellness, even their view on the world. So we're really at the infancy, and we have to be very careful with jumping in too quickly and trying to do precision therapeutics when it comes to the microbiome. I like to always look back at evolution and see, what did our ancestors do to support their microbiome that led us to this phase where we are right now, where we're the top of the food chain, top of the evolutionary ladder. So just going back to the basics, playing in the dirt, eating a diverse diet, getting rid of all these chemicals we know that harm us, seems to make the most sense right now. So the birthing process and even gestation is a really important time for starting to develop the microbiome of the child. We used to think of the whole womb and the birthing canal and all that is fairly sterile. But now we know that the womb, especially in utero, is not a sterile environment. We actually find mom's gut bacteria in amniotic fluid and even in the cord blood. So there's indication that there are immune cells that go and pick up mom's good bacteria from her gut and actually transport it into the fetus in utero through the cord blood, through the amniotic fluid, to get the baby exposed to certain types of microbes before the baby even comes out. Then the next step is the breaking of the water. The breaking of the water actually plays a significant role because it unleashes and kind of disrupts all the microbes that are sticking and adhered to mom's birth canal. It kind of releases them and makes them open for transfer, right? So there's a significant process in that. And as the baby's moving through the birth canal, he or she's picking up huge amounts of microbes, not only on its skin, but also in its mouth and its nose, eyes, oral cavity, and so on. And it's interesting when you look at mom's vaginal bacteria, because the vaginal bacteria microbiome is actually one of the areas where you don't want a lot of diversity. There are 5 specific strains, lactobacillus strains, that actually are predominant in the vaginal microbiome. And if you start to see lowering amounts of those 5 strains, you start to get disruptions in the vaginal microbiome like BV, bacterial vaginosis, or chronic UTIs or yeast infections. But what happens by the second trimester of being pregnant is a particular bacteria called Lactobacillus johnsi starts to gain high prevalence in the vaginal canal. And that's really interesting because Lactobacillus johnsi, one of its main functions is digesting milk. And women are not digesting milk in their vaginas all the time. And so the only reason for that bacteria to increase in prevalence is to inoculate the baby. So the baby has a significant amount of Lactobacillus johnsi, so it can start digesting mother's milk right off the bat. So it's a wonderful, beautiful system to see how the body changes different parts of the microbiome, how the ecology can change in preparation for this really important event, which is delivering a child, right? And from an ecological standpoint and from an evolutionary standpoint, that is extremely important. That is the whole issue with perpetuating our species is, can we do healthy live births? And so once the baby passes through the vaginal canal, gets inoculated with all the bacteria, then after a period of inoculation, then there's something we call succession. And that's the bacteria start to specialize in their specific regions. If you take a newborn baby and you swab the baby's eyes, ears, mouth, vaginal canal, if it's a girl, skin, all of those microbes resemble mom's vaginal bacteria. About 6 months after the baby's born, you swab the skin, gut, mouth, and so on. It starts to resemble mom's skin bacteria, vaginal bacteria, gut bacteria. They start specializing in their role. So that becomes a really important way of inoculating, getting the baby started with their microbiome journey. Breast milk is one of the most amazing natural compounds or foods that you can find. I always say it's the only mammalian food that's been perfected by evolution, right? Women till this day are still making breast milk because it's absolutely necessary. And despite how much research has been poured into infant formula since the early 1800s, they still today cannot match mother's milk, right? And we have some of the best scientists and biggest companies working on this for over 100 years, and they still cannot match the nutrient potency of mother's milk. Now, one of the aspects of mother's milk that's really important is the fact that it contains 600 to 800 different species of bacteria. Mother's milk is loaded with microbes. It's one of the most microbial dense foods. And then the other thing it contains is up to 200 different oligosaccharides, which are prebiotics. And these prebiotics, babies can't even digest for energy. It's there purely to help seed the microbes that the baby's been exposed to and that's coming in from mother's milk. So the composition of mother's milk and the exposure to mother's milk is extremely important. We now know that bottle-fed babies versus breastfed babies have a higher prevalence rate of metabolic disease, have a higher prevalence rate of allergies, asthma, even things like type 2 diabetes, obesity, and so on. We know that impact of not having mother's milk is something that can be realized for the lifetime of the child. And it can start early. The child can develop allergies, asthma, and all that early on, or the child can end up being obese in their teens and later 20s and so on. And all of that stems from just not getting the right microbes through mother's milk. And when you really understand the importance of the natural birthing process, of moving through that birth canal, the fact that in the U.S. today, I think it's still around 33% of births are C-section, and of course, some of them you can't help. The baby's breech, or there's other complications, but many of them are still elective. And in fact, a lot of doctors will encourage their patients to get elective C-sections because it's easier to schedule, right? And in our modern world of being scheduled and having everything on the calendar, that just seems to be the easier thing. The problem with that is babies that are born from C-section that don't pass through that birth canal, that evolution has designed for us to perpetuate as a species, you end up getting exposure to very different types of microbes. So what you see in babies that are C-section born is the initial microbes they get exposed to that are predominant in their body are things like Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, rather than Bifidobacteria, Lactobacillus, and all the known to be good commensal bacteria. So those C-section babies tend to have a much higher prevalence rate of immune dysfunctions, allergies, asthma, psoriasis, eczema, higher incidence rate of things like ear infections, which means that then they're getting more antibiotics early on in life, and more antibiotics early on in life will cause a trickle-down effect of disrupting their health and wellness down the road as well. So it's the start of a process that really messes up their ecology and causes much increased risk for disease down the road. As a microbiologist, I've always secretly been an evolutionary biologist on the inside, right? Because I love bacteria and I love digging into how we interact with bacteria, the good and the bad, and how they shape the lives that we live and shape our bodies. But the simplest way to really dig into the impact of microbes and how we can live a longer, healthier, really good life is by going back to the basics. Going back to how we interact with nature. We have created this amazing symbiotic relationship in our bodies. There was this a microbiologist that won a Pulitzer Prize, and he actually had written a book that said that there were 3 species in the world that would survive almost any catastrophic event that happened on Earth. Those are ants, termites, and cockroaches. Right? And the reason for those 3 is because they are community organisms that work together really well. So no matter what the stresses are, they do a really good job of working together as a singular community to perpetuate the health of the whole. Right? And that's exactly what our human body is. We are a community. We're a walking, talking rainforest. And anytime we do anything to disturb or perturb that community, we're really setting up disease. And if we look back at our ancestors and how they lived, their interaction with the dirt, their lack of sterilization, consuming huge, diverse amounts of foods, not eliminating entire categories of foods because of fancy diets that they hear about. Those are simple, basic things that we can adopt today that will make a huge change in our microbial community and then perpetuate health and wellness. We got to go back to basics. That's the simplest thing we can do today, and it's so highly effective. Like birth control, that's a simple one to go after, right?
Yeah.
Because we look at and we go, okay, did our ancestors use birth control and estrogen pills and progesterone pills and so on? And when you think, no, they didn't, and so if we are using it at high prevalence rates, probably creating issues within our body. And so then comes a study that was published and conducted by Harvard University, and what they showed is that women who are on birth control have a 300% increased risk for Crohn's disease, which is a gastrointestinal disruptive disease. And it's a progressive disease, it's autoimmune, it causes really horrific lifetime changes. And that just comes from the use of birth control pills, right? And then when you really dig into the science, you can figure out exactly why that happens. There's a constellation of bacteria called estrobolome that's responsible for metabolizing estrogen within the body, and it seems like we're screwing up that estrobolome by utilizing birth control pills. But estrobolome doesn't just metabolize estrogen, it also controls a lot of the immune reaction in the lining of the intestines. So they don't just do one job, they do multiple jobs. And when we mess them up by utilizing synthetic hormones as a daily regimen for no really good reason, then we start disrupting their function in other areas too, and we develop Crohn's disease. Which then requires us to go into all kinds of steroid treatments and scopes, and it's just a perpetuating, system of leading us down the wrong path and really disrupting longevity. All we have to do is look back at our ancestors and go, did they use birth control? No, we probably shouldn't be using birth control. It can be that simple. The immune system is a really interesting system in the body. First, it's important to note that it's the only system in the body designed solely to protect us. That's its one and only function. However, the immune system is the hardest working system in show business, I always say, because they have to encounter so many different things on a daily basis and figure out whether that thing is friend or foe. And that includes the hundreds of trillions of microbes that are sitting in the gut right on top of the immune tissue. Right? So imagine the job of these innate immune cells, like the first line of defense cells, things like dendritic cells and macrophages. Their job is to move around in this sea of microbes and flip around each one, tap them on the shoulder, if you will, and have them turn around and figure out whether they're friend or foe. And this is what they're doing on a daily basis. Now, what's really interesting as we come to understand the immune system is our microbes within our gut. And the microbes within the environment are the ones that train and tutor the immune system. So I always describe the immune system as like an army with all of the equipment. They have the soldiers, they have the tanks, the planes, the bombs, but they have no general and they have no plan. We're not born with an understanding from the perspective of our immune system of what the world looks like, of what to attack and what not to attack. We have to learn that, and that learning is called immune tutoring. We come to find out that the microbes in our environment are the key trainers of our immune system to develop something called oral tolerance. The microbes will actually show the immune system what to attack and what not to attack. And the moment we start eliminating our exposure to these microbes, our immune system becomes more and more naive. And when the immune system is naive, it attacks everything it sees. And that can be as simple as things like peanut protein, dairy, or ragweed or pollen, and cause really irritating things like allergies, or it can be as severe as an autoimmune disease. It starts attacking your own intestinal cells. It starts attacking your own joints, starts to attack your own brain tissue. It causes severe chronic diseases. All of that comes from the immune system just being naive and not getting enough exposure to the right types of microbes to train itself. So as you're developing, one of the things that's extremely important is how you train your immune system. And part of training your immune system is getting sick. And that exercises all the capabilities of the immune system. Things like quarantining the infection, being able to exercise the right cells to be able to neutralize the infected cells or get the viruses and bacteria that are causing the infection, to also sequester infections and prevent them from spreading within the body. All of the chemical signatures that go into recruiting more immune cells into that space, or even cells that repair the damage that's being done. All of those things are learned by practice. And also, the next time you're exposed to the same thing, you get a much better response to it. Fever, for example, is something that our body creates. right? So when you're first exposed to something, part of the defense system is the creation of fever. And so the creation of fever increases the body temperature, which actually makes it harder for viruses and bacteria to grow and proliferate within the body. So that's a defense mechanism. But it's your first line of defense. So that's like your general response to any sort of virus or bacteria that your body sees. Now, once it's learned about that virus and bacteria, because it's attacked it once, the second time around, you probably never even get the fever, because we don't need the first line of defense. The immune system goes, oh, we've seen this before, we know how to deal with it. Let's send in the specialists who are now designed to attack that very particular bacteria or virus. So the process of getting sick is that kind of training. And you actually exercise your immune system and make it more intelligent just by getting sick. So we get really scared of kids picking up colds and flus, and we want to vaccinate them against the flu, and we want to give them medications and all that to prevent colds and viruses exposure, and of course sanitation, all of these things. But all of that is such an important part of training the immune system. So with the lack of exposure to illness, and which means that we have a lack of training of the immune system, what happens is the immune system becomes more and more naive. And as it becomes more and more naive, it really starts to exercise its capability in the wrong way. And that can be as something as simple as starting to attack its own cells or your own commensal bacteria within your gut. So this whole prevention of exposure to things that could possibly make a child sick early on in life can actually lead to a very naive immune system in their late teens, in their early 20s, that's now attacking their own intestinal cells and causing things like colitis or Crohn's or other autoimmune type of conditions. And so it becomes extremely important for people to continuously exercise their immune system and allow it to learn the environment around itself, right? Because when it doesn't know the environment around itself, when it's not exposed to the microbes that we inevitably breathe in and are exposed to and so on, then it becomes perturbed and becomes reactionary. And it starts to attack things that it shouldn't attack because it doesn't have the knowledge. And a lot of that can be prevented by just kind of being a little dirty. Allowing kids to pick their nose, allowing kids to play in the dirt and not sanitize them afterwards. You go for, and I see this all the time, I try to go out in the woods as much with my kids and, just kind of hiking and playing in the dirt and so on. And you see the moment they're done with that hike and they sit down to eat a sandwich, and they're squirting all the antimicrobials to clean off all of that wonderful earth that's on their system. And you need to get that kind of exposure to continue to train the immune system. Vast majority of diseases we look at today can be attributed to disruption in immune response. And that includes things like diabetes, heart disease, cancers, and of course every one of the autoimmune diseases as well. One of the things, and this actually came out of a really funny incident. I was at the park with my son, who was at that time, I think he was 3.5 or 4. And he made some friends who were around the same age, and they were talking. It's always funny to listen to kid conversations. They're so pure and natural, right? And one of the things they were talking about is boogers. And they were going, I eat my boogers, I eat my boogers. They were like all sharing with each other that they eat their boogers. And it got me to think that, okay, we all did that, right, as kids. It just seemed like such a normal, natural thing. You'd pull out this gross, slimy-looking thing out of your nose, and your instinct is to put it in your mouth, which is completely crazy when you think about it as an adult. But we all did that. Every culture around the world does that. What is that instinct to eat your boogers? So then I started thinking about, well, what is a booger? A booger is actually a natural oral vaccine. So on a daily basis, you're inhaling microbes all over the place. Because, for example, a bird could fly by your house, right? And that bird will shed microbes as it's flying by, or it lands on your roof. It sheds microbes as it's sitting there, and those microbes get sucked into your air vent system and gets blown out through your air conditioning. So in the air, you've got huge amounts of microbes that are all floating around that you're sucking in on a daily basis. Once that microbe gets sucked into your nasal system, then your mucus layer basically covers it. And what's inside your mucus layer are immune cells and antibodies and all that basically tag those microbes. Then when you take that booger and you swallow it, it presents that microbe along with immune factors to something called the Peyer's patches in your small bowel. The Peyer's patches can then amplify an immune response against it. So you're basically immunizing yourself to the world around you. So it becomes such an important thing, and it still exists today, likely because it was very important in the evolutionary development of a human species. We have to inoculate ourselves with the environment in order to teach that. So a booger is an oral vaccine. Don't let your kids, not eat their boogers. Don't discourage them from doing it. In fact, if they want to have booger parties, let them have booger parties. The more the merrier. Oftentimes people will call the gut the second brain. I think it's debatable whether it's the second or the first brain. They're both about 2.5 pounds. So if you take the full load of microbes within the gut, it weighs about 2.5 pounds. When you look at the brain, it's about 2.5 pounds. They're very interesting. The gut is the only part of the body that can function independent of the brain because it has, of course, its own ecology, its own metabolic system. It can perpetuate without the brain being involved. Every other organ in your body requires the brain to signal it to function. And so then we started looking at influences of the brain from the gut itself. And as it turns out, the bacteria within the gut have a direct connection to the brain. And it's a two-way system. And that's through the enteric nervous system. So the enteric nervous system basically covers the entire digestive tract from the mouth all the way down to your bottom. And there's more nerve endings in the enteric nervous system than in your spinal cord itself. So it's a very dense neurological system. That enteric nervous system, which the bacteria in your gut have direct access to, connects to something called the vagus nerve, which goes right to the brain. So imagine this, that bacteria within your gut can actually produce chemicals like neurotransmitters, peptides, things that could influence your thought and the way you react to the world around you, and directly send it to your brain through the vagus nerve and the enteric nervous system. Your brain can then communicate directly with your gut as well to try to get help from the bacteria in many ways. For example, in hormones. Hormones signaling is a two-way mechanism. Our gut microbiome makes basically every hormone that our endocrine system can make. And our endocrine system, through our brain, can talk to our gut and say, hey, we need more of this hormone or that hormone, whether it's serotonin, dopamine, any of the stress hormones, even testosterone is being made in the gut, we now understand. So that gut-brain connection is something that we're really starting to understand, and we're really starting to understand that our bacteria will determine so much of how our brain works, even more than how our brain can influence what our bacteria is doing. The best explanation for what the appendix is really it's a reservoir for bacteria for you. It is post-gastric, so meaning it's past the stomach acid, and so most of those microbes that live in the appendix would actually be fairly sensitive to stomach acid, especially as an adult. But the appendix is post-gastric. It's there to kind of start continuously inoculate the microbes within the intestinal lining because, of course, naturally we do things that kill off the bacteria. And so the idea of removing this organ, because they didn't really understand what it did, was just kind of crazy. So there are parts of the body that exist today that they weren't sure what it was for, but evolution has selected for that part to remain. So going through and cutting out that part of the body seems to cause a significant amount of issues down the road. And of course, there's appendicitis. People get inflammation in the appendix. It can burst. There are dangers with that. But for the most part, we should really be trying to preserve that appendix because it contains our really unique flora, and that's like the seeds for our actual flora. So cutting out important parts of the body like that are really, it's an amazing thing to think about, that we would just go and lop it off and then not assume that it's going to cause a significant amount of problems down the road. So tonsils play a really important role as draining cavities really for your immune system, right? So we've got all of these glands all over the body that are real sites of action. For example, if you get something an infection going on in the upper respiratory system, tonsils are a really important gland where the immune response to that is being basically structured. And if we start removing these kind of glands, we're really suppressing our body's ability to actually go after infections, viruses, bacteria, and so on. And so now we know that we've got this issue with chronic viral infections in places like our upper respiratory system, in the dorsal root ganglias, in our jaw lines, and places like that, like Epstein-Barr virus, cytomegalovirus, that can remain there forever because our immune system just is not well equipped to go after them. And part of that could be because we've removed these key immune glands out of our system. And once they're not there, we can't conduct the functions that we need to go after these guys. So stress is probably one of the number one things that causes long-term chronic illness in our society, and the mechanisms for which now are much more clearly understood than even 5 years ago. Recent review published in 2015 in the Journal of Immunology showed that stress-related endotoxemia, and we'll talk about what that is probably the number one cause of morbidity and mortality in the developed world. Stress-induced endotoxemia, and so it's amazing to think how much of an impact stress can have. So the two areas where stress can really destroy health and wellness and longevity is one in the increase in permeability of the intestines. We now know that stress and the response to stress, which is the release of stress hormones, can actually increase the permeability of your intestines, which allows for more toxins that should be sequestered in your digestive tract to leak into your bloodstream on a regular basis. And when it's leaking into your bloodstream on a regular basis, what we're doing is we're inducing a chronic activation of the inflammatory part of our immune system on a regular basis. And it never goes away, it never subsides. Even though that momentary stress is gone, the leakiness of the gut remains. And so the effect of that stress is there for the next several days, weeks, maybe even months. And then, of course, next time you get stressed again, it reopens up and you start having those issues. So that's what we call endotoxemia, and it comes from leaky gut. Endotoxemia is basically toxins that are produced from your own good commensal bacteria that are supposed to be sequestered in your digestive tract and then excreted out through defecation is now basically entering your bloodstream and causing huge amounts of immune activation. The same kind of immune activation that has been shown to start the process of heart disease, start the process of obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancers, autoimmune disease, and so on. All of that starts with opening up of the tight junctions, the leakiness of the gut, and all of those toxins coming in. So how does stress make you gain weight? Well, that's how it is, because that kind of endotoxemia promotes obesity. How does stress affect the heart? Well, that endotoxemia starts up the process of inflammation in the vessels. Same thing with diabetes and so on. Now, the other place that stress can actually cause further issues is we now know that the increased expression of stress hormones increases the virulence of fairly dormant but yet opportunistic viruses and bacteria. So take Epstein-Barr virus or cytomegalovirus or even certain strains of E. coli or Clostridia within the gut that are just there, normal parts of the gut. They're not infective. They're not causing any problems. In some cases, they're actually doing some beneficial things. The moment you get stressed and you have all this release of stress hormone, it actually makes them more virulent and makes them infective. It gives them the opportunity to become pathogenic at that point. And that's another way that stress can kind of create this long-term chronic infection that your body, that causes significant disruption within your body. I just did a talk at a conference this last weekend, and it was a focus on autoimmune disease, right? And so one of the things we know about autoimmune disease is that you have to have some sort of genetic predisposition, which most of us actually do. And then the second part is you have to have some sort of intestinal dysbiosis, and the third part is an environmental trigger. So I went through this thought experiment of how a single cell phone call could create lupus in your body. So follow me on this, right? You get a stressful phone call from your partner or your boss or whoever it may be, and you put the phone to your head and you start talking. The stress from the call alone starts the body into an inflammatory process. It starts a leaky gut that we've talked about, starts the inflammatory system and the immune activation. 50 megahertz of EMF from your cell phone for just a few minutes is enough to trigger Epstein-Barr virus or cytomegalovirus to start becoming more infective. It actually increases the opportunity for those viruses to become infective. Those viruses stepping up their infectivity will actually cause your immune system to start attacking tissues around where those viruses are. And inevitably, they start attacking your own tissues. So you're on a phone, you're having the stressful call that's already setting up inflammation. The EMF from the phone is increasing the virulence of these viruses. Then you put down the phone, and now your body's dealing with increased infective viruses, and then now it's dealing with inflammation coming out of your gut. Those two things are enough to set your body down a cascade of autoimmune disease. That can translate into lupus, it could translate into rheumatoid arthritis, it could translate into one of the 100 of autoimmune diseases that we know about today. So we know that these EMFs can at least affect the pathogens that live within the body. And there's more work coming on how it could possibly affect the microbiome, but right now we know that they can at least affect the pathogens. When we look at populations that tend to be really healthy and live long lives and actually have really good cognitive function, and they deal with stress well, they're relaxed, you find that most of these do their own gardening, right? And in fact, gardening has been so powerful, and it's being realized now that people are actually utilizing gardening therapy for people that suffer from mood disorders and emotional disorders and all that, and there's a calming effect to that gardening. And you see that in such great prevalence in these societies where people live longer, healthier lives. There's, of course, numerous things when you're eating your own clean food. There's no pesticides and all that on them. But now we know that within the soil itself, there are certain microbes that actually affect our psyche in a significant way. So recently we've discovered a bacteria called Microbacterium MVK. Microbacterium MVK is a common garden soil organism that when you're exposed to it, it gets on your skin and it gets into your nasal cavities and into your mouth eventually. It actually is one of the most potent stimulators of serotonin within your gut. And serotonin, our happy hormone, is produced largely in our gut. And so we now know the biochemical and the microbiological reasons for why gardening can actually make you happy. But these societies have known that for hundreds of years, and they've been just growing their own stuff, playing in the dirt and getting exposed to that dirt. Now we know that at least there's this one bacteria that can get into your system and stimulate the production of happy hormone. So it's so significant just to get in there and get in your dirt and make your own food. One of the most exciting things to figure out is how your microbiome allows you to adapt to your environment. And again, our chromosomes are limited, right? So we don't have enough DNA in our system to really conduct the day-to-day functions that we require, certainly not to adapt to a new environment. Two great examples of that is if you look at the Inuit Indians, they have a diet largely based on seals and fat. And seal fat, but their microbiomes have changed to a point where they can actually do that kind of diet and actually consume that kind of diet in a healthy way without all the inflammation associated with having a really high-fat diet. And their microbiomes have done that for them. Another great example is Japanese people. If you look at the species of Bacteroides within Japanese gastrointestinal tracts, the Bacteroides within the Japanese population has the ability to produce an enzyme called beta-porphyrinase. Beta-porphyrinase is an enzyme that breaks down seaweed. And they have this because they eat a lot of sushi, which has seaweed on it. Now, the beauty of where this enzyme came from and the DNA for this enzyme, it actually comes from the fish itself, the bacteria in the fish, because it's raw fish, right? So they're not sterilizing it, which is a smart way to do it. So they're getting actual live bacteria from the fish entering their system, and the bacteria that live on the fish have the capability to produce this enzyme because the fish are eating seaweed. And then now the Japanese population's guts have picked up this capability for them to break down seaweed because they're eating a lot of it. So their microbiomes have adapted them to that environment and the things that they tend to be exposed to. Mm-hmm. In the Western population, most of us don't have the ability to create this enzyme beta-porphyrinase because we don't eat seaweed that much. And so it's amazing to look at how different parts of the world, people's microbiomes have allowed them to adapt to their specific environment. Another very simple thing is I come from India, and I was born in India and grew up in India until just before high school. And when I was in India, I could drink the tap water in India and be perfectly fine. Having lived here now for over 25 years, if I go back to India and drink the tap water, I will probably get very sick. And the difference there is my microbiome has changed significantly from moving to the Western world. The microbiome, when you live in India, has developed resistance and capabilities of dealing with those types of microbes that you see on a daily basis, versus now the microbiome that I have in my gut is completely different. And so it's wonderful to see how the microbiome can allow you to adapt to your environment if you allow the microbes from the environment to come into your system. So when we're looking at people that live in these zones where they tend to live over the age of 100 years old, they tend to live much longer than in most Western populations. What's really interesting is that they all have their own varied diets and lifestyles. If you take one of them from one place and implant them in another place, they probably won't do as well. The commonality between all of them is their insistence on interacting closely with their environment and not separating themselves from their environment like we do today. The water that they drink comes from rivers and streams in their natural environment, which means that they're getting all the microbes that are coming in from animals that bathe in the same water, or even defecate in that water, urinate in that water, or the soil organisms that get pulled into the water after a rain. They're getting exposure to all of those environmental microbes that allow them to be supremely adapted to that environment that they live in. The example of the Japanese people with their ability to produce that beta porphyrinase enzyme is a great example of that, where they're pulling that capability from their environment. And if Japanese people took fish and only cooked the fish, they would likely not have that capability, but they're eating raw fish, so they're getting that environmental bacteria coming in. So the one commonality among all of these areas where people tend to live much longer, happier, better lives in general, is that they allow themselves to be exposed to their environment in a very great degree. So one of the things we know is that lack of sleep can really disrupt the ecology of our microbiome. And one main reason for that is our sleeping process actually encourages the growth of certain types of microbes within the body, like Akkermansia. Akkermansia is a very important bacteria that actually improves our metabolic system, improves the excretion of damaged DNA in cells and things within the body, reduces inflammation in a drastic way. That type of bacteria does really well during the sleeping process. If we're shrinking our sleeping window, we're not allowing those kind of key bacteria to flourish. And when they're not flourishing, then we find the physiological effect of them with increased inflammation, increased stress, inability to deal with stressful situations that come up in life. And then just the lack of stress management because of the sleep, because of the disruption of the ecology of the gut, then increases the pathogenicity of viruses and bacteria and all that. So it's like this snowballing effect where a few nights of lack of sleep will disrupt the ecology of the microbiome. And because the ecology of the microbiome is disrupted, we can't deal with stress as well. Because we can't deal with stress as well, the viruses and bacteria that could be harmful to us start to do well in the body and create disease. One of the most important things with perpetuating a healthy microbiome, which means a healthy life and longevity, is interactions with other humans. And not just humans, but other species of animals as well. We now know that there is a centralized kind of microbiome cloud, if you will. We're all familiar with the cloud where we can upload and download stuff. It happens with the microbiome as well. So there's this community of genes or genetic elements or community of microbes that exist around people. And you can measure it in households. And so having a good social community, that interaction, hugging people, when you see them rather than just handshaking or high-fiving, makes a big difference because we're exchanging bacteria, we're exchanging DNA, we're exchanging genetic components as well that play a big role in how healthy we are. An example of the negative side to this, where we can show a perturbation in the system, is I was privy to a lecture that's being on a research study that's being done, I believe at Johns Hopkins. This was at a conference I was speaking at on the microbiome early this year. The study hasn't been published yet, but the data is fascinating. What they were able to show is that they were following households where one individual in the household had to go through a course of antibiotics. And then they followed that individual's microbiome over 6 months after the antibiotics. And what they showed was that the individual's microbiome remained perturbed up to 6 months after the antibiotics. They could show the dysbiosis, right? What was really crazy about it is they found that the people that live in the same household, whether they're intimate partners or non-intimate partners, even platonic partners who are not sleeping in the same bed, had the same disruption in their microbiome without taking the antibiotic. And they could measure this even up to 6 months after the one individual was done. So when you're living in a household with other people, you've got a microbial community. And when one person disrupts the community by taking a course of antibiotics, it actually disrupts the microbial community of everyone in that household. And it can be measured. And that's what's crazy about it. So community is extremely important. One of the things I always tell people is, I see this all the time when a baby is born, right? And family members come to visit the baby. The first thing everyone is forced to do is sanitize their hands. They have the biggest jars of hand sanitizer I've ever seen in households where newborns are born, because everyone that walks in the door has to go through a sanitation step. And that's really defeating the purpose of interaction with the baby, with their friends and family and neighbors and so on. It's actually extremely important for people to come along, hold the baby, kiss the baby, hug the baby, and do all those things and exchange those microbes. We get so scared with each other with our microbes, right? But what we don't realize is, as a collective, we become healthier if we share our microbes. That's our collective strength, comes from our microbes. And when we let the microbes interact with each other, it perpetuates the whole species. One of the key components in immunology is something called toll-like receptors. Toll-like receptors are really interesting because, we've known that the microbes line the gut lining, and that's where most of your immune tissue is. So 80% of your immune tissue is in your gut. It's in the intestinal lining. We also know that that immune tissue is covered by trillions and trillions of bacteria. So the question has always been, how is it that the bacteria interact with the immune system on a daily basis without causing inflammation and immune reaction that would be similar to immune reaction against disease, right, which would be devastating to the system on a daily basis. So how is it that these microbes can talk to our immune system on a regular basis without enacting an immune response, if you will? And then the discovery of toll-like receptors helped explain that. So toll-like receptors are these really interesting receptors that are expressed on many of our cells, including, of course, our immune cells, that are expressed in response to the presence of certain types of bacteria. And the bacteria allow the toll-like receptors to upregulate, which will recognize patterns on those microbes themselves. So they will recognize patterns on both pathogenic organisms, so that our immune system knows, oh, this toll-like receptor is activated, that means it's a bad bacteria, or these toll-like receptors are activated, which means it's a fine, friendly bacteria. So in this case, we don't start eliciting an immune response. In this case, we do elicit an immune response. So it's a really interesting communication tool between our commensal bacteria and the rest of our immune system. And what we start to find is that when we have low levels of expression of certain types of toll-like receptors, we become overactive in our immune system and start to attack everything. And we have no way of actually perpetuating the expression of our own toll-like receptors. We count on bacteria to do it. And so lack of exposure to bacteria, perturbations in our ecology, will disrupt the expression of toll-like receptors and that key communication, what we call crosstalk between the microbiome and the immune system. One of the most complicated things in the world is our own ecology, our own body's ecology. And one of the things that really has confused scientists and medical doctors is the presence of microbes and viruses that we think of as being pathogenic and harmful. And if they're there, should we kill it? Should we go after it? A great example is the systematic attack of H. pylori. Right? Helicobacter pylori is an important bacteria that's actually quite commensal to your stomach and your upper GI tract. However, some H. pylori can cause ulcers. And so now what they've done over the last 25, 30 years is anytime they see H. pylori on the test, that it's there, it's positive, they hit it with antibiotics. Oh, it shouldn't be there, it can possibly cause ulcers, so let's get rid of it. Now, further studies have shown that the systematic eradication of H. pylori actually increases the risk for gastroesophageal cancer. So H. pylori was playing a really important role in maintaining some form of homeostasis within the body, where it reduced our risk for cancer and inflammation associated and that drives cancer. So this systematic attack of microorganisms that we look at as bad actually causes more disruption down the road, because again, we have to think of ourselves as an ecology. They all play a role. Clostridia is thought to be really bad, right? If you have high levels of Clostridia, that we got to attack it with antibiotics and get rid of that Clostridia. Well, no, actually high levels of Clostridia is associated with lower incidence of allergies, asthma, psoriasis, atopic dermatitis, and so on. So Clostridia play a really important role in training the immune system, how to function. And so the thing that we have to realize is we don't know what we don't know. There's so much to know. There's so many things we don't know that we don't even know the information that we're missing. And the ecology of our body is extremely complicated. And anytime we start to do these precision attacks on microbes, we tend to create more problem than solution. So microbes have to talk to one another. They have to understand who's within their environment, and that's part of their competitive nature, but also part of the way that they communicate with each other. Let's give you a pathogenic example of that. So listeria is a known bacteria that is a food contaminant that can cause disease in the body, right? Listeria at certain concentrations is completely benign. They don't attack, they don't start expressing their toxin producing genes. They wait till they reach a certain threshold in order to start expressing it, because the bacteria knows that if we start expressing now, we're going to alert the immune system. We're not strong enough to cause any problems, and we're just going to be suppressed. So the way they communicate with each other, so they know what their concentrations are, is through this process of quorum sensing. So each bacteria in the world excretes a chemical signature of itself that other microbes within its same species can read. And so they send out this chemical signature. That's how they communicate with each other, saying, hey, we're at 1 billion now, or no, we're at 10 billion, we're at 100 billion. And when they get to that certain threshold event, then they all synchronize their gene expression and they express toxins. Now, on the good side of that is the same thing. Microbes will communicate to one another in the microbiota, and they will understand what microbes are there in abundance and what microbes are there and are suppressed. And certain microbes, like Bacillus endospores, for example, that are environmental bacteria that can police the gut, will go in. They have the capability of reading all of the bacteria signatures and figuring out who's there and who's there at too high concentrations and who's there at low concentrations. They will actually find overgrown and harmful bacteria. They will get into that space and will produce up to 25 different antibiotics to kill that group of overgrown bacteria. And then they'll go over here where bacteria are undergrown, using quorum sensing to read that environment, and they'll produce prebiotics to regrow that bacteria. So they're going in and kind of shaping the microbiome by reading microbial signatures that are being excreted out into the environment. And what scientists are trying to do is figure out, how do we interpret some of this speaking among bacteria? Can we use quorum sensing for the good? Can we take bacterial language and cause that to affect changes within the microbiome? We're far away from that. That part of nature it's actually a little more complicated than we are smart right now. But we allow nature microbes to do that for ourselves, like the microbes in the dirt, like the Bacillus species. They'll get in and do that all that work for us. They'll use quorum sensing to fix our microbiome. So one thing that's so interesting is the ability of microbes, which are prokaryotic cells, a whole different kingdom of species that can communicate with eukaryotic cells, which is what we are. This is something called inter-kingdom communication, right? So when we look at like our dog, the ability of us to communicate with our dog is really limited, right? We can train our dog to do certain things, but if a dog spoke English, we would be fascinated. That would be the most famous dog in the world, maybe the most famous organism in the world. So imagine that different organisms or different kingdoms actually can speak the same language. A plant cell can speak to our cells. A bacteria cell can speak to our cells. They do this through chemicals that they produce. So there are a few different ones. One is called OMVs, outer membrane vesicles. These are really interesting. They are little nano capsules that bacteria can produce, and in the capsule they'll put things like neurotransmitters or little peptides or microRNA. And these capsules actually have what we call a trophism or affinity for certain parts of the body. So these, imagine a bacteria in your gut can release one of these nanocapsules with a neurotransmitter in it. That nanocapsule is designed by the bacteria to have an affinity for our brain. So it'll surpass all of the other parts of the body and make a beeline for our brain and release the neurotransmitter in the brain. That's how amazing their ability is to communicate with the rest of our body. These microRNA that they can release will actually go and interfere with our own gene expressions. So imagine a bacteria within your gut can create a piece of microRNA that can stop the expression of certain genes within your own cells, or will enhance the expression of certain genes within your own cells, or even more crazy, will change what the gene is supposed to make. Right? So the gene, let's say, is designed originally to make a particular protein to help your body conduct some metabolic activity. Because of the microRNA that the bacteria sent, it now changes the type of protein that gene is making. So they can control every part of our genetics, whether it's in our mitochondria or whether it's in our cytoplasm, whether it's in our chromosomes, and plant cells can do the same thing as well. So we communicate Our cells communicate with plants that we eat through the same kind of system. And so when we think of our diet, and we think of consuming plants and fruits and a diverse set of vegetation, even roots and tubers that grow in different environments, we think of it more from a macronutrient standpoint, right? The fiber content, the fat content, the carbohydrate content. What we're forgetting is all of these really important chemical signals that we absorb from these foods that actually affect the type of DNA expression that we have and how our cells function on a day-to-day basis. So imagine that a plant that you consume, besides the fiber and all that you get from it, have phytochemicals in it, plant-based chemicals that can get in and actually affect the expression of genes within our body. We now know that these polyphenols that come from plants can actually affect things like cancer risk or immune dysfunction risk. And how do they affect it? Well, there's the oxidative stress component to it, but we also know that they could probably change gene expression in our own body. So our communication, our ability to communicate with the world around us is far more prevalent, specialized, and amazing than we can ever understand. To think that the plants that we eat can communicate to our cells to not become cancerous is amazing. The implications of that are phenomenal. And then when you think about plants, they're grown in different areas. So a root or tuber is grown in the dirt. So their environment, what they're exposed to, the types of RNA that they would have would be completely different than a fruit that's hanging higher up on the plant, exposed to air in a different way, exposed to birds sitting on it, and other types of animals that basically interact with that fruit, versus the ones in the earth where there's earthworms and other things that aren't found in this higher level. So our opportunity as a species is to get as much exposure to all of this stuff in order to perpetuate our ecology. And that's where we falter. We do not allow ourselves to get enough exposure to all of these amazing things within our environment to perpetuate our own health and wellness. One of the biggest things we do that perturbs our gut on a daily basis is food. And we eat a significant amount, and in fact we eat far more than we really need to. Our sense of our caloric needs is completely off in the Western world. And in fact we push this on our kids too. One of the things with kids that's a great example is that they eat when they're hungry and they stop when they're full. Their systems for communication between their microbiome, their brain, and all of the organs involved in digestion of food works extremely well. But we put upon them this system of eating where they have to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And if they skip lunch for some reason, we get worried. Like, oh my God, they didn't eat today. Yet they're bouncing off the walls. They have endless amounts of energy. And what that should indicate to us, is that our feeding systems, our timing of these meals, having breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day, and snacks in between, maybe not the right thing to do. And it's probably not evolutionarily supported. Humans ate when they were hungry. They didn't eat when they weren't hungry. And one of the things we're starting to understand is caloric restriction in our diet has huge benefits, health benefits, and implications to our body, because one of the biggest and most toxic things we do on a daily basis is eating food. Just the process of bringing in food, digesting it, all the release of bile acids and hydrochloric acid, and the breaking down of the food matter, all of this stuff causes massive amounts of bacteria die-off in our gut. When the bacteria die, they release their endotoxins and things like that. Now, if our gut is leaky at that same time, all of that stuff is getting into our circulatory system and causing inflammation. Being able to leave our microbiome alone and not feed it for a period of time is one of the healthiest things you can do for your microbiome, and in fact increases the diversity of the microbiome. And that's completely counterintuitive. We think in order to get our diversity of the microbiome, we got to keep feeding it food, right? We're feeding the biome. No. In fact, it turns out the more we fast and the more we restrict calories, the more diverse our microbiome turns out to be, and the more healthier we are. And you would look at hunter-gatherer tribes and humans that live an ancestral life right now, and they fast quite a bit, and they don't eat a lot, and they restrict calories, but not on purpose, but just because they're following signals from their microbiome. One of the ways that we can look at the impact of overfeeding and high caloric meals on the microbiome and the satiety signals is we did a study on leaky gut. We call it metabolic endotoxemia or postprandial endotoxemia. What we were really studying is how the process of eating induces that leaky gut, the opening of the tight junctions, and the leaking in of all the toxins from the intestinal lining into the blood system. So what we did is we took about 100 healthy college kids. These are people in the prime of their lives, right? Physically, they look perfect. They're low body fat, not obese, no frank disease. None of them had any diagnosed disease or illness. They were just normal, healthy college kids. We screened them all for this metabolic endotoxemia or leaky gut syndrome. What we did is that we had them come in fasting, and when they were fasted in the morning, they came in and we took blood samples of what's called endotoxins in the blood. So we're looking at intestinal-derived toxins in the blood. And what we find is a very kind of low basal level of these toxins, not really causing any problems, not really causing any issues. Then we give them what we call a challenge meal. In this case, it was a fast food meal, a fast food breakfast, it's a muffin and hash browns and orange juice. And then 3 to 5 hours later, we measure the same toxin in their blood. We saw on average a 600% increase in toxicity in the blood. And the university that we work with previously did the same study where they showed that a single meal takes the body 2 weeks to recover from. The inflammation and the immune activation that comes as a result of that one single meal and the 600% increase in toxicity takes 2 weeks to recover from. And imagine we're doing this every single day, 2-3 times a day, so we never really recover from it. What's significant about that is that that same toxicity, that same increase in inflammatory cytokines and markers are the exact same markers that are associated with heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune disease, and so on. So it's that process of eating and the generation of leaky gut endotoxemia, especially from fast foods and highly processed foods, that seems to be perpetuating this condition. One of the other things we found in this particular study is we were looking at the hormone called ghrelin. Ghrelin is a hunger hormone. And one of the things that really doesn't work well in Western society is because it causes us to overeat when the hunger hormone is expressed continuously at high levels. So in this college kids, what we had is we measured the ghrelin levels when they came in fasted. And it was pretty high, as we would expect, because they're in fasted state. I think the minimum was about an 8-hour fast, so the ghrelin levels were high. Now, we gave them a 2,000 calorie meal. For most people, that's more than a day's worth of calories, right? And after that meal, the ghrelin levels stayed almost as high as when they were in a fasted state. So the communication between the gut saying, hey, we've got plenty of calories in here, shut down the hunger hormone, and the brain and the endocrine system that's making that hormone is totally lost. We're not getting that communication. What's really fascinating is then we gave them these Bacillus endospores for 30 days. These are, again, environmental bacteria that you would pick up from the environment if you interact with your dirt. We gave them those as probiotics. 30 days later, they came back. We did the same exact test. They came in fasted. We give them this challenge meal. We measure the toxicity level in the body. We also measure this ghrelin hormone. What we found is that the ghrelin hormone dropped by over 50% after eating the meal. So now, just in 30 days of being exposed to these bacteria, all of a sudden the microbiome is communicating to our brain that we're full, we don't need any more calories, stop eating. Versus 30 days prior to that, that communication was completely lost. And it's absolutely fascinating to think that a simple bacteria can restore that important communication between our gut, our brain, and all the endocrine system that produces these hormones. There's been some good population studies that have looked at the differences in changes in microbiota over a course of a 12-month period between Western populations and then also more native populations who eat seasonally. And in fact, it's what they were able to show is that the microbiota starts to change as the seasons change in anticipation of different foods coming in. Right? Now that change is totally disrupted in the Western world. We stopped seeing that change any longer because we basically eat the same things all year round. And we have access to foods that shouldn't be in season, artificially are now in season, and so our microbiota gets confused. And anytime we mess up the cyclic effect of the microbiota, we mess up the metabolites they produce, we mess up the types of DNA either enhancement or suppression that they do. All of the things that we know to be important metabolic functions of the microbiota get suppressed. because we suppress their natural cyclical function. And we know in healthy populations that there's a significant seasonal change in the microbiota. One of the most important functions of the microbiota is the production of metabolites and active ingredients for us. There are numerous things that we don't really get from food in high abundance that when we given the substrate, the microbiota can produce for us. Like take B vitamins, for example. We've got all of this talk about methylation deficiencies and the fact that we can't methylate our B vitamins that are coming in from food. And so it's so important to supplement with methylated forms of B vitamin. Well, the difference there is that the increase or the presence, the high prevalence of this methylation defects within our body is likely not evolutionarily important because our bacteria do the methylation for us. Genes that have significant impact on human wellness and health tend to get eliminated through the process of evolution. But certain genes that are very prevalent that disrupt the absorption and function of micronutrients that aren't as important because our microbiome does the same thing for us can remain in high prevalence in the population. So let's talk about B vitamins that the microbiome produces. What we know is the microbiome produces the full array of B vitamins within our gut, and they produce the methylated forms of the B vitamins, which are the most useful forms to us. And a healthy microbiome can actually produce so much B vitamin that less than 30% of it is actually required to utilize within the human body itself, right? So they can do that in such great abundance for us that we don't really need to be supplementing these all the time. What we need to be is just allowing a microbiome to get diverse, feeding a microbiome a diverse source of macronutrients so that they can do the work for us. And we've outsourced this work to the microbiome. So they produce so much B vitamin that less than 30% is actually absorbed and utilized by the human cells. The rest of it is actually being converted into things called coronoids and other methylation agents that actually go on to affect our DNA expression. At the same time, we know that our microbiome produces every form of quinols, so CoQ10, ubiquinols, things that we look for in supplements and spend a lot of money for in supplements, even things like carotenoids, antioxidants, beta-carotene, alpha-carotene, astaxanthin, zeaxanthin. All of these amazingly important micronutrients are produced at high levels in a healthy microbiome. And the beauty of it is all being produced right at the site of absorption, right in the microvilli, where things need to be sucked right in. We don't have to worry about it going through the gastric system, going through production and encapsulation and all that stuff. Vitamin K27 is a very important vitamin produced by the microbiome. So much of the essential nutrients within our system are produced by microbes within the microbiome. Yeah, one of the things that we do that really perturbs our microbiome and causes imbalances, which then can lead to significant disease, is really narrowing our dietary intake of macronutrients. It's very trendy in the Western world to go into certain types of diets, whether it's paleo or it's FODMAP diet and all these kind of things that we love to put a label on. And what it does is it causes us to eliminate whole categories of foods. And one of the things that we know about humans is humans were omnivores. Right? We survived and we perpetuated through the course of evolution because we ate everything. And there's not a lot of species on the Earth, on planet Earth, that are omnivores. If you look at, for example, a lion is an obligate carnivore, right? And it depends on the population of things like gazelles and wildebeest in order to survive. So to think about the ecology of the lion, for example, it's sitting there in the sub-Saharan Africa, and let's say there's a drought. And its one or two food sources, the wildebeest or the gazelle, is really low in numbers because the drought has taken away their vegetation. So now the lion is totally oppressed from a health perspective because its one food source is not present. It's not like the lion can go and eat a bunch of berries and get by, right? It's not like the lion can dig for roots and tubers and get by. In fact, if they eat anything plant related, it gets sick. The same thing with the herbivores that the lion feeds on. They're very dependent on certain types of vegetation in order to perpetuate their species. Humans have evolved because we can eat everything. If there's no roots and tubers, we'll go pick some fruits. If there's no fruits and vegetables, we'll kill a baboon and eat a baboon. We will eat insects. It doesn't matter. We can eat so many different things, and our microbiomes afford us that capability. The diversity in our microbiome is directly correlated to the diversity in our diet. And if you look at early humans, and even if you look at tribes like the Hazara tribe in Tanzania right now, who mimic early human dietary intake, they eat upwards of 600 different types of foods on an annual basis. And they tend to have very diverse and robust microbiomes. We eat somewhere around 15 foods on an annual basis, and that has really shrunk the capacity of our microbiome. Everything we feed our body selects for certain classes of bacteria. So if we only feed our body certain categories of foods, we only select for certain bacteria. And the thing about the ecology of the gut that's important to understand is it's not about good versus bad. It's about imbalance. And so when we feed ourselves just a narrow number of things in our daily diet, we're causing imbalance. Imbalance leads to disease. And that's how we affect our health in general. One of the things we think of is, we go to a high protein diet, right? And we're so stuck on that, and so we eat a lot of meat. One of the things you realize from evolutionary biology is that meat was kind of a delicacy in most human diets, because the amount of work it took to go and chase down an animal and kill it and eat it was significantly greater than just picking a fruit or picking a plant or digging for a root and tuber. So our microbiomes evolved to occasionally see meat. And of course that meat supports the growth of certain important bacteria. But if all we're doing is eating a large amount of meat with every single meal, if you look at the average American plate, it's the meat. And then the greens are accents around the side of the meat, right? And that really perturbs the microbiome. It causes the overgrowth of Prevotella species and certain species of Clostridia, even things like Enterobacter do better in meat conditions rather than plant-based foods. And so what we're doing is causing an unnatural imbalance within the microbiome that now has been associated with disease as well. The other thing is, because a lot of us will have leaky gut, the saturated fat that comes from meat, and it's not, I don't want to demonize fat in general, but what happens is the saturated fat that comes from meat is incorporated by the bacteria within your gut, and they produce their endotoxin using the saturated fat in the meat. It just so happens that the endotoxin they produce from using fat from the meat is far more toxic than the endotoxin they would produce from using oils, let's say from seeds or from olives and things like that. And that saturated fat causes a much higher degree of toxicity in the endotoxin that they produce. So now not only are we perturbing the appropriate balance within our microbiome, but we're causing the microbes to produce more toxic versions of their natural endotoxin that they produce. One of the things about globalization is it's lost upon us what we're really adapted to consume. And if we look at the North American diet, coconuts are not really a big part of the North American diet, and how many of us actually live near natural coconut trees. But we love fats, and we love darlings of health industry, and coconut oil has become one such darling. And same thing with palm oil, and same thing with any sort of trends that we adapt. For a while there's soy was the darling of the health industry, right? It was perpetuated as being much healthier to eat a soy burger versus a regular burger, a beef-based burger, or it was healthier to eat a soy burger than eating something that would be considered high carb, like a vegetable or fruit. But now we know that overconsumption of soy actually has hormone implications within our body. They are phytoestrogens, and they can cause significant hormone imbalances. Same thing with coconut oil. Coconut oil inherently is not bad, but our abuse of these things, we start gargling with it. We start, doing oil pulling. We're putting it in every kind of food. We're adding it to our beverages, our coffee, and things like that. We're putting it in our skin. And one of the things people don't realize is that coconut oil has a lot of long-chain fatty acids. And these long-chain fatty acids are very strong antimicrobials. And when you consume high amounts of coconut oil, those antimicrobials are killing off bacteria at fairly large amounts. And when the bacteria are killed off, itself, they release their endotoxins. These same endotoxins are the ones that trickle into your circulatory system and end up causing chronic immune activation. Same thing with coconut oils tending to have a lot of saturated fat in them. Saturated fat produces more toxic levels of endotoxin rather than non-saturated fats. And so this abuse of what we consider darlings of the health industry really causes more problem than benefit. And one of the things we have to look at is, what is our environment naturally like, and what are we supposed to be consuming on a natural basis? What did North Americans this far north of the equator, what were they consuming to perpetuate our evolution, to bring us here today? And how are we disrupting that by allowing the globalization and the availability of all these things to mess up what our balance should really be? One of the most, I think, harmful words we've developed is the word carb, and we categorize everything as carbohydrates. Anything that's not meat or not fat or protein is carbohydrate. We would put French fries in the same category as celery, because they're all carbohydrates. And the whole perpetuation of this notion that carbohydrates are bad for you, we all should be on low carb diets, is actually causing a significant amount of perturbation and illness within the microbiome itself. In fact, the vast majority of bacteria in our microbiome, the good, healthy bacteria that we need to have in high abundance, require carbohydrates as their primary source of food. Sure, there's our simple carbohydrates, that are made up of fructose, sucrose, glucose, and simple monomers or sugars that will increase the insulin response of the food and cause metabolic distress. But the vast majority of fruits and vegetables don't do that. Even rice, people were staying away from for a long period of time because they're saying it was so high glycemic. But rice has this really beautiful structure of carbohydrates that are branch chains that have significant different bindings to them that feed different types of microbes within the gut. For example, xylans, fructans, arabinogalactans are all really interesting bonds and linkages that you find in carbohydrates that feed very specific types of bacteria. I'll give you a great example of this is kiwi. We're now looking at this kiwi fiber. That's really interesting, and we're finding that this kiwi fiber can specifically increase the growth of Faecalibacter prosnitzi. This is a very important bacteria that's supposed to make up about 5 to 7% of our microbiome, right? So that's 5 to 10 trillion organisms is what this is supposed to make up. But in the Western population, this bacteria is really low, and low levels of this bacteria is associated with high risk of colitis, Crohn's, and other gastrointestinal disease, including colon cancer. The thing that feeds these bacteria are really interesting linkages that you find on certain types of foods. And on a kiwi, if you take a golden kiwi or green kiwi, that linkage is found on the actual peel of the kiwi. So even when we do eat the fruits and vegetables, we mess it up by taking the kiwi, slicing it open, and nicely, neatly scooping out the inside part and leaving the beautiful fibrous prebiotic parts of the outside of it. So we get so specific, and we become so ready to demonize foods and demonize whole categories of foods to the actual detriment of our microbiome. So the carb notion in general, that carbs are bad for you, is a complete myth. Carbohydrates from plants, fruits, vegetables are extremely important for the health and wellness of our microbiome. If we eat a low-carb diet, we're actually reducing the diversity of our microbiome and eliminating certain microbes that should be there in high amounts. Yeah, bread is an easy one to demonize, and then you start seeing people going to fast food restaurants, ordering a hamburger, and saying, "Oh, I don't eat the bun." So it's totally fine. They're eating that piece of thing that we could probably barely call meat, and then they're omitting the bun and saying that's healthy. And the thing is, the vast majority of the populations in the world eat some form of bread. In fact, in many places, it's a staple part of the diet, whether it's a tortilla, or in the Indian culture, we eat naans and parathas and chapatis, which are all breads. In the Middle East, they eat a huge amount of breads. All of these are produced by a wide variety of grains. And the thing is, grains have linkages in them that can feed very specific microbes within our gut. For example, take barley. Barley barley has high levels of beta-glucan. And beta-glucan is a very specific prebiotic that feeds specific types of microbes within the gut that other sources of foods just cannot feed. And so taking grain, natural good grain, and processing it into bread, which is an easy way to eat the grain, is actually a normal part of how humans evolved. And the demonization of bread will actually lead us to eating substitutes that are actually much worse. Now we have kind of grain-free breads and these things that are actually where they replace the carbohydrate portion with more fatty portions. And that actually perturbs our intake of macronutrients and also messes up the microbiome. So it's not about the bread itself, it's about our body's ability to handle the bread and the kind of bread we eat. If we're making bread from regular old good whole grains, it's totally fine. And in fact, it feeds the microbiome in a very positive way. One of the most important things in the diet of modern humans is understanding where our food comes from. We're so quick to categorize foods into good and bad categories, right? I know a lot of people that don't eat any cruciferous vegetables, or they say, oh, I can't handle nightshades, right? These are huge categories of foods that have tremendous nutritional value to not only our bodies, but of course the microbiome, which controls virtually everything within our system. You are far better off eating a good, varied diet where you know where your food's coming from, and you know it's free of pesticides and growth enhancers and artificial ripening, and of course chlorine-based cleaners that are used to wash a lot of the produce and things like that. If you have some sense of traceability for your food, you know where it's coming from, that becomes the most important thing you can do in your diet, rather than looking at whole categories of foods that you want to eliminate from your diet with the false notion that you're going to be perpetuating health. It's better to look at how clean your food is. What is the quality of my food? Should I be eating a fruit that's not currently in season, that has been artificially ripened to be in season and then shipped across the country to be able to eat it here? So having that seasonal aspect, having that ability to look at, or the focus to look at the quality of the food that you're consuming, is a far better thing to do in terms of dietary lifestyle changes to enhance health than just eliminating whole categories of foods. Same thing with meat. Like, to me, I will rarely eat meat that I don't know where it came from. If I know that it's a chicken that's free range and healthy, then okay, I'm going to enjoy that chicken. But if it's just a chicken breast sitting in some sandwich in some cooler somewhere, I don't know where that chicken came from, how it was raised, or what it was fed during its life, then I'm not going to put it into my body, because that has far more implications on my health than eliminating something like, I'm not eating meat anymore, or I'm not eating carbohydrates anymore, or fats anymore. Understanding where your food comes from is absolutely the most critical thing you can do for your life and your health and wellness. When you look at communities that have a great amount of longevity and tend to live over the age of 100 and so on, one of the things you start to realize is they really understand where their food comes from. And in many cases, they make their own food. Many of these people are growing their own food in gardens, and they get a lot of their vegetables and a lot of their carbohydrates and roots and tubers and seeds from their very own vegetables. They may even keep animals of their own, pigs, chickens that they rear and they grow and they slaughter for their own consumption. That is the next, the evolution of how humans eat. And the funny thing about it is, it's really coming back to basics. We've gone so far from that. And then we now understand that how far we've gone from that interaction with our food sources can cause significant disease. So even things that are packaged as being quote unquote healthy, they have all the bells and whistles to them. Like, you see meat that'll say it's grass-fed, free range, GMO free. Well, that's nice, but how is it processed? All of these things they'll add, for example, in meat products, they will impregnate them with starches. And the reason they impregnate them with starches is, as they go through the cooking process, it retains more water. So the bite is juicier, the weight is retained, and that impregnation with starches, then putting them through high pressure treatments because of that, perturbs and disrupts the amino acid profiles within the meat itself. Or you look at vegetables, one of the first things that any vegetable goes through in our typical food distribution system is it gets chlorine washed. Everything that's picked and processed, it gets chlorine washed, and then they put them through these ammonia baths. fats and things like that that actually are supposed to kill off microbes, and then they mill them down and they put them through high heat pasteurization. All of these processing things that can actually disrupt the molecular structure of the food, and it's that molecular structure of the food that's so critical to feeding the right microbes. So processing will disrupt the total quality of the food, and it basically negates the impact of the food on our body. And that impact comes from the food being able to feed the microbes in the right way. So alcohols are really interesting because, we were actually working with a wine company that was trying to look at how do we enhance the health benefits of alcohol and make claims associated with health. And they were warned immediately that you will be shut down within minutes if you're trying to make any sort of health claim related to alcohol. But alcohol, if you look at the history of it, comes from fermentation. And it's one of the oldest foods that man has actually developed. And it started inadvertently, of course, with fruits getting naturally spoiled by fungal overgrowth, and then animals eating the fruits, humans eating the food. And then we, of course, refined our process of fermentation. And alcohol, even though it has a bad name, true, like pure alcohol fermentation produces a beverage that's really high in polyphenols, and then the alcohol content tends to be high in organic acids. So a lot of these organic acids that are really beneficial to the body, that can reduce inflammation, actually support the growth of good bacteria, reduce the pH in the gut, which is another very important aspect of it, actually are retained well in the alcohol component of it. So even when you separate the polyphenols out of the red wine, for example, the polyphenols themselves have benefit, but the alcohol portion contains all these wonderful organic acids. One healthy alcohol that most of us know about but don't really realize it's an alcohol is kombucha. We know of kombucha to be this darling of the health industry, and it's so popular, and it's so, it's loved by people with the health industry. But kombucha is really alcohol fermentation, because during the process of making kombucha, it does produce alcohol. We just stop it at a certain point so that the alcohol content is very low, below certain regulatory amounts. But as the yeast is producing the alcohol, it's also producing all these amazing organic acids, and that's really what's giving you the health benefit from it. So polyphenols that you can get from things like red wine, and of course even coffee. Good coffee has high degrees of polyphenols. Teas have high degree of polyphenols. Then the alcohol side of things with the organic acids has even more enhancing benefits.